All right, everybody, here we go. Let's talk about communication disorders, chapter 1. One thing I want you to think about while we go through the chapters is, chances are you know someone who has a communication disorder or you have one yourself. So how would your life be different if you woke up tomorrow and suddenly had a communication disorder? Or if you have a communication disorder, how would your life be different if you woke up tomorrow and you no longer had it? So just kind of as we go, and we'll talk about that and what that would mean as we go along. All right, communication. So your book talks about what is communication: the transmission of thoughts or feelings from the mind of a speaker to the mind of a listener. All means by which information is transmitted between a sender and a receiver. So you got to have two people, right? You got to have a sender and you've got to have a receiver, right? The three main communication purposes are to request something, to reject something, and to comment, which kind of encompasses everything other than requesting or rejecting. You've got two communication players. You've got to have a sender or a receiver. So when I'm talking to myself in the morning about maybe what I have to do that day or where my clothes are or whatever, right, that's not communication because there's no one else listening. There has to be both a sender and a receiver, and the message has to be received and understood in order for there to be communication. So we got to have 4 steps for the communication process. You've got to have formulation, transmission, reception, and comprehension. Formulation is the organization of one's thoughts or ideas. So that's sort of getting prepared to speak. So you have the idea, you turn that idea into language, and then you get ready to produce that language. Transmission is then conveying ideas to another person or animal or something else. So, and we can do this by speaking, by signing, by gesturing, by writing, by sending out a video, right? Lots of different ways to convey ideas to another, not just through speech. We do it lots of different ways. Then we've got to have reception, which is receiving the information. So, all right, the other person has to receive the information, and they also have to understand the information too. That's part of reception. It's not just, I've received it, but I understand it. And then we have reception, which is receiving the information. So I've heard the information, or if it's sign language, I've watched the information. Right, but so I've received it. Now that doesn't necessarily mean I comprehend it yet. So comprehension is the last step. So this is understanding and organizing that message, right? So I can only speak and comprehend English. So if somebody gives me a message in Spanish, in Chinese, in anything other than English, I can receive the message, but I have no idea what it was. I can't comprehend that message. Right. So human communication, right, it's really social interaction among people is a big part of this, right? That we come together as people to communicate for better or worse, and it's how we interact with each other, and it impacts other people. So again, for communication to exist, it's got to be between two people, or as we'll talk about in a second, two animals, right? So it's always going to impact the other person in at least some small way. Your book talks about animals. Do animals communicate? I think, all of us would answer that as a yes, that they definitely do, right? When I wake up in the morning, we have cats and dogs, but really anytime I walk into the kitchen, my cat tells me that she hasn't been fed since 1998 or something. So, she always tells me she's hungry, she hasn't been fed. Well, I know that she has, but that's how one way that she communicates with me every day. So, successful communication. So we talked about what communication is and needs, but what's successful communication? Got to have that sender. You've got to have that shared symbolic system. Right, so again, you got to have a person who sends it. you've got to have a shared symbolic system. So it can't just be, two people have to both speak English, both speak Spanish, two people have to both know sign language, whatever that symbolic system is, they have to share it so they can understand it. There's got to be that other person to receive it. But then there also needs to be feedback, right? So feedback is information provided from the receiver to the sender. And this is so important because if you have little kids or if you're around little kids, you know that they'll keep saying the same thing unless you acknowledge them. So, Dad, can I have lunch? Dad, can I have lunch? Dad, can I have lunch? Dad, I haven't eaten yet. Dad, can I have lunch? And it's like, hey, okay, I really heard you the first time. But they really need, especially kids, really need that feedback, or they have no idea whether it's been heard or not. So a couple ways to give feedback. One way is just linguistic feedback, is just through words and language, saying, yes, or acknowledging in some way verbally that you've heard them. Non-linguistic, extra-linguistic feedback is, where you're going to, that's really through body language. So you can nod your head up and down for yes or no, or kind of change your eyes, or kind of look at, if you don't understand something, maybe you can look at someone a little differently to let them know that I'm not totally getting this. And then there's paralinguistic feedback, which is the use of the tone of your voice, or your volume, or something about the way you say something to tell someone you understood. So if I ask you if you understand the 3 different kinds of feedback and you say, yes, I do, that's very different than you saying, yes, I do. That tells me you didn't understand it. Same words, right, but different paralinguistic feedback. All right, language, speech, and hearing. Your book calls these the essential ingredients of human communication, but I bet if you were somebody who use sign language, you would say, well, you don't really actually need speech to communicate really well, that you can do, you can communicate perfectly well without speech. So, and again, if you can't hear, you might not have speech or hearing, but you can still communicate well. So, take that for what it's worth. And that these are used for the formulation, transmission, reception, and comprehension of information. And especially, if we're talking about speech, then you need to have hearing in order to comprehend that message. All right, language. Language is the cognitive process by which we formulate ideas and thoughts. It is a rule-based system of symbols and codes used to communicate, right? So if you just look at all the letters here on the screen, right, that these are all, we've all got these weird symbols and lines that somehow we've all learned that, what an A looks like and what an S looks like, and then also if you have letters together, what those mean, right? These are all just kind of symbols and codes that we just made up. And it's a form of social behavior shaped and maintained by a verbal community. And we'll talk more about what we mean by that, about how sort of society shapes and maintains what we do. And again, you can this can be oral language, and there's also non-oral language. So things like sign language and things like that would be examples of non-oral language. Right? So language is a socially shared code that uses a conventional system of arbitrary symbols. So again, all these kind of scribbles on your screen are all just arbitrary symbols that represent ideas about the world that are meaningful to self and others, right? That we just made up all these things, and we've made up everything, right? There's no real reason why we call a chair, right? Maybe the reason we call it chair and chair is because it comes from, maybe there's a Latin root or another kind of root, but at some point someone just made that up, and we all decided to call a chair, and there's really no other reason. It's just completely arbitrary. When we're going to talk about language, especially from a speech-language pathologist standpoint, we'll just break it down into expressive and receptive language. So expressive language is language that is produced, so spoken, signed, written. And then we've also got receptive language, is language that's understood, listening and comprehending, right? So you can have a child who she is totally on the mark receptively. She understands what's said to her. She understands, she can read. But when she then has to express language, either spoken or written, it might really break down. So she might be totally within normal limits for receptive language, but expressively she's struggling, and she might need help of some kind. So language is universal, meaning that every culture in the world, as far as we know, well, not as far as we know, but we know every language in the world every culture in the world has language. It's universal. It's also species specific. So, and a lot of this comes from Noam Chomsky, who we'll talk about a little bit, and he was a linguist, and back in the 1950s, he really shaped how we think about language today. And one of the things that he argued is that only humans have language, so that all animals communicate, but he believed that only humans have language, and we'll talk about why with these next three really. So language is also decontextualized, so that, right, you can talk about something that happened over the summer. So if I say, hey, how was your summer? Oh, it was great. My family went on this trip. We went to blah, 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 blah. And none of that's in front of you. None of that, you're just coming up with that from your brain. Right, we're pretty sure that like our cats can't do that. Like my cat tells me she's hungry. She tells me she's happy when she purrs. She tells me she wants to go outside, but it's all right now. Like I don't know, even if I spoke cat, if she could really tell me, what she did last year, or kind of what her hopes and dreams are for the coming academic year, right? That's probably not going to come from my cat, even if we spoke the same language, because we're not sure she has one, right? So animals aren't able to be decontextualized as far as we know. And then also language is productive. So you can teach kids, words, and kids pick up words and say things that they've heard, but really soon, 3-year-olds are producing sentences that they've never heard before. So they're uttering their own unique sentences, putting words together in a way that they've never heard, but they know how to combine them and produce new words. And as far as we know, again, we're not sure that animals can do that. Certainly Chomsky didn't think they could. So that if you teach a gorilla how to do sign language, right, they can sign things and learn things, but we're not sure yet whether they can come up and combine them in different ways to form new sentences and things like that. That might be incorrect, though. We might be on the verge of realizing that animals are much more complex than we thought, but at least as of now, that's where we are. And then the other argument, the other thing about language is it's learned really quickly by young children, right? Kids have their first words right around their first birthday, and by the time they're 2, they're already speaking at least 50 different words, and then we get this explosion of language, and they understand tons of language. So it's very quick, and it's pretty natural for, most kids to learn this really complicated, hard thing fairly easily. All right, so, and again, we talked about Noam Chomsky a little bit, and he was a linguist, and he So he studied linguistics, which is the study of language, its structure, and its rules. And language has a tremendous amount of structure and rules that we don't even think about. And we'll talk about that in a second. So, and again, the idea that the community arbitrarily selects the codes or symbols of their own languages, and it's sort of the study of why they do and how they do it. And we've got a few domains of language that have, some of these domains only really have one main area, but some have more than one. So we've got content, which refers to the meaning of what we're saying or writing or signing. Form refers to the organization of that language. And use refers to how we're actually using the language. So let's talk about each of these. So if we're going to break that down further, we've got three main areas that cover form. We've got phonology, morphology, and syntax. And then we've got semantics, which covers content, and pragmatics, which covers use. So there are 5 main areas of language: phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Phonology is the study of speech sounds and sound patterns, and it examines the rules and processes that govern the patterns of sounds and sound systems, right? So if we wanted to make up a new word, that word would have to adhere to the rules, to the sound rules of our language, right? You couldn't say, hey, I've got a new word, and the first 3 letters are LJR. Right? You can't do that. In English, we don't combine those words together, especially at the beginning of a word that violates that rule. It's got to be something that follows the rules. So all of our new words have to follow the rules of English phonology. A phoneme is the smallest unit of sound. So if I say the word phoneme, f, o, n, e, m, it's got 5 phonemes. The f, o, n, e, m. So it's not about the letters at all. It's just we're just talking about the sounds. So the word phoneme has 5 sounds in it, 5 phonemes. Speech is basically the production of meaningful phonemes, right? Morphology. Morphology is the study of structures. And a morpheme is the smallest meaningful units of language, right? So a phoneme is the smallest meaningful unit of sound. A morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit of language. Words contain at least one morpheme. And we've got different kinds of morphemes. You can have a base morpheme, a prefix, a suffix, and free and bound morphemes. So an example of a base morpheme would be the word cat. Right, so cat, you can't break it down any smaller than that, right? In order to mean cat, you've got to say cat, the whole thing. And so that has meaning all by itself, right? That one unit of language has meaning. We've also got prefixes and suffixes. So a prefix would be a unit of language that you would put before the word. So the word, before the word. So if we're talking about the word agree, right, and if you add the prefix dis in front of that, it turns agree to disagree. So the prefix dis, right, has meaning and therefore is a prefix. Suffix goes at the end of a meaningful morpheme. So suffix could be something like ing or s. So you can turn run into running, or runs. So that the suffix is a morpheme that goes to the end of a word. All right, and you can have, within all of those, you can have free and bound morphemes. So a free morpheme would be a morpheme that can stand all by itself. So you could also kind of talk about a base morpheme as a free morpheme. So a cat is just a cat. It has meaning all by itself. Run has meaning all by itself, right? Read has meaning all by itself. It's a free morpheme. A bound morpheme is those prefixes and suffixes. So the ings, the s's at the end of words, the eds at the end of words, to talk about past tense, right? They don't have any meaning unless they are attached or bound to another word, right? So ing only has meaning if I attach it to run, and then it's running, right? So those are all the different types of morphemes we can have. Syntax. Syntax is the arrangement of words to form meaningful sentences. And this is what, Noam Chomsky kind of talked about syntax as the rules of language. And when we're talking about syntax, we're talking about grammar. So sort of word order, how words go together. And Chomsky really believed that grammar was innate within us, and that humans had grammar, and that was the sort of cornerstone of what language was. That we naturally can put words in order to then think and talk about the past, the present, and the future in a meaningful rule-based system. Semantics is the study of meaning. So the referent theory of meaning. So person, place, or thing, right? And kind of the whole purpose, even though Chomsky argued that the sort of the core of language is the grammar, the syntax, the whole purpose of language is to communicate. At least most of it is. So, and if it doesn't mean anything, it doesn't communicate. So Chomsky came up with the idea of colorless green ideas sleep furiously. All right, that's perfectly grammatical. It's syntactically correct, but semantically it's worthless, right? It doesn't mean anything. So talking about how the importance of meaning. Lastly, we've got pragmatics, and pragmatics is the study of the rules that govern the use of language. And we're really talking about language function, and a speech act. So words influence listeners, saying is doing, right? So pragmatics is, how we use the language. And think about how rule-based that is, right? If somebody walks up to you and says, hi, what do you say? You're going to say hi. And maybe you're going to say, how are you? And they're going to say, I'm good. How are you? And you're going to say, I'm doing great. And maybe you'll say something about your day. And then they'll say something about your day, right? So all of that is just programmed, right? It's like if you're sending a text to somebody and you suddenly realize that your phone already knows what you're saying, and like you could just press the button to get, all the next words will just come in because you're following rules of how to use language, and you've used these before, right? And we often will say the same kinds of things over and over again because we're following the rules, right? If you walk up to somebody and say, hi, how are you? And they say, I have a red car. It's like, whoa, you're not following the rules of language. That's be a really interesting thing to say. So it's like that's not what we expect. So we're very programmed. We're a lot more robotic than I think a lot of us like to believe.